He's either the funniest smart guy on TV or the smartest funny man. We'll find out which in a minute.
If you had to say it in a single phrase, this one line said clearly by then Crossfire host Paul Begala might just get at the heart of what Jon Stewart in his very finest form is all about.
I do. Over the years, you have called us, and we're going to put this on the screen because this is heavy stuff. A biased organization relentlessly promoting an ideological agenda under the rubric of being a news organization. A relentless, agenda-driven, 24-hour news opinion propaganda delivery system.
Yeah.
Where do you come up with this stuff?
It's actually quite easy when you feel it. You got to feel it in your soul, you know.
There's that force of brazen honesty unperturbed by situational discomfort.
What's happening, baby? Can I tell you something? You made the right choice. You are leaving this place. You know what you are? You're the last guy out of a burning building, my friend.
John!
You are...
Stop!
Oh, I'm sorry. Are we on CNN?
Right? Yeah.
A passionate advocate for justice, fighting for the voiceless few that America had left behind.
Our response time to 9/11 was 5 seconds. That's how long it took for FDNY, for NYPD, to respond to an urgent need from the public. Your indifference cost these men and women their most valuable commodity, time.
But most importantly, I saw and in many moments still see that rare combination of intellect and humor, able to address the most controversial issues of the day directly to the faces of its mainstream narrative drivers.
No, but, if there's evidence, I'd love to hear it.
There's a novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan novel respiratory coronavirus lab.
Most importantly, in a manner that sufficiently ridicules the absurdities and unproductive theatrics entangled in politics.
There's no question that Mr. Stewart is going to hell.
Your hell doesn't scare me. I make my living watching Fox News 8 hours a day. I'm already in hell.
Is it ideologically informed? Of course, something Stewart has always admitted.
My comedy is informed by an ideological background. There's no question about that. But the thing that you will never understand is that Hollywood, yeah, they're liberal, but that's not their primary motivating force. I'm not an activist.
But, as a comedian, it never seemed like his ideological intuitions came at the expense of his comedy's highest purpose. That is, until recently.
Where do I go to study the particulars of unquestioning propaganda? I would need mentorship.
We're in Moscow tonight. We're here to interview the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin.
This past week, in Jon's second episode since returning to The Daily Show, I found myself conflicted. The jokes seemed a little less funny, more malicious, and the points Stewart made were evident but superficial, as if his comedy was being guided by something substantially distinct from the spirit of eliciting laughter. And then, in a moment, it became very clear what was going on.
I know I've said this before. You're such a dick.
Who do you think you're more fun on your show? Just my opinion.
Okay, Jon Stewart goes one-on-one with his fans.
You're as big a dick on your show as you are on any show.
May the villains of old remain villains anew. Jon Stewart's return to The Daily Show premiered with a prescient attack on a two-party system.
One thing we know for certain is this. We have two candidates who are chronologically outside the norm of anyone who has run for the presidency in this country, in the history of this country.
Marred by mediocrity and a lack of accountability, desperately clinging to the remaining shadows of its frail elitists, mired in scandal and incompetence, buttressed only by engines of banal propaganda and duplicity.
He's focused, he's bright.
He is sharp, intensely probing, and detail-oriented and focused.
This is a man who is sharp, who is on top of his game, who knows what's going on.
Mr. Biden will likely present himself to the jury, as he did during his interview with our office, as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory.
Gratuitous remarks that the former Attorney General talked about.
Gratuitous.
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 Gratuitous. Gratuitous.
The conduct of the response in the Gaza Strip.
He lambasted both sides handily, prompting their pathetic retaliations and exposing the true struggle taking place between the elite class and those it attempts to manipulatively manage. However, episode 2 had a slightly different tilt. The critique of elitists remained, a commentary on the absurdities of public journalism emerged, but surrounding it all, I saw vendetta,
As much as you try to convey a mixture of what appears to be shame, arousal, and I'm going to say irregularity.
I saw the continuation of a petty squabble, hearkening back to a different moment in time, framed by a conviction that the man in question must be evil.
To your point, though, about like a guy like Tucker Carlson, like that's cynical. What he does is cynical.
Yeah, I definitely put him on the evil side. I wasn't going to speak for you, but
no.
For me, I put him in the...
No question.
I feel like he knows exactly what he's doing and saying.
No question.
Or maybe, John, you just don't like him very much. Because whatever you think of Jon Stewart or Tucker Carlson, this episode highlighted several relevant psychological tensions. Tensions between the mentalities that animate both Stewart and Carlson. Needless to say, both are people with starkly different views of the world, not to insist one is superior to the other. But ultimately, Stewart carelessly oversimplifies the motives of Tucker Carlson. He describes a man fully consumed by the gravity of power's allure, aroused by his own ego in relationship to it, and obsessed with an image of prominence and prestige. While this may be one relevant aspect of Tucker, I prefer to believe that people are more complex than their worst portrayals, and for Jon to use his form of influence to insinuate to his left-wing audience that Tucker is purely evil, albeit providing decent comedy, will perpetuate a psychological strawman that inevitably exacerbates political echo chambers this channel seeks to bridge. Now, with that serious intro out of the way, like I did with David Pacman last time, I want to begin this analysis with what I consider the very best of Jon Stewart, because he's a cool dude.
Like, I was hoping it'd be like some bizarre thing, and I'm like, we've come a long way, baby. It's the exact same.
How do you feel about the science now, though?
Well, so I will say this.
Here is Jon on Colbert, one of the quintessential voices of establishment thought. Colbert's job, to put it bluntly, does not involve challenging conventional orthodoxies. Up to that point, the establishment media had been promulgating a prevailing narrative about the origins of COVID-19. And so, we enter a discussion on that subject. Now, consider the time frame of this video's release. It's 2021. We've moved past the brunt of pandemic fears, and people are now realizing the extent to which mainstream narratives might have been manipulated in their presentation. The media establishment is tap dancing around this issue like there's no tomorrow, and Jon Stewart enters the scene and takes a sledgehammer to that widely dispensed narrative.
Science has, in many ways, helped ease the suffering of this pandemic, which was more than likely caused by science.
And you can see Colbert's discomfort.
What do you mean by that? Do you mean
perhaps feigning incredulity at the idea that COVID-19 could have come from a lab? A lab? Seriously, Jon? Are you really saying all of that conspiracy that I don't feel comfortable saying on camera might be worth consideration? And Jon is like, listen to me, Stephen.
Well, but
oh my
if there
God.
is evidence, I'd love to hear it.
There's a novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do we do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan novel respiratory coronavirus lab. The disease is the same name as the lab. All right.
Jon.
Oh my God. Oh my God. There's been an outbreak of chocolatey goodness near Hershey, Pennsylvania. What do you think happened? Like, oh, I don't know. Maybe a steam shovel mated with a cocoa bean. Or it's the chocolate factory. Maybe that's it.
A timeless moment indeed, in which someone with a lot of popularity and power says something different. And to really demonstrate the comedic brilliance of all of this, just listen to how Jon provides this dark but comedic relief at the end through the following.
Horrible, horrible things. Natural resources that run down. That'll all be fine. The world ends, the last words man utters are somewhere in a lab. A guy goes, it worked.
This is the Jon we love. This is the Jon who asks questions with his comedy. Not telling you this is right and this is wrong, but is simply encouraging us with his wit to inquire a bit more. He never says it definitely has come from a lab. You hear that, YouTube? He isn't telling us what to think. But have you looked over here? Did you see how insane this looks? A virus has emerged out of Wuhan. For what reason? I don't know, but maybe the lab is a good place to start. And so we see comedy at its best, pushing back against the suppression of reasonable thought through mockery. Continue further and we get to Jon's premiere episode, highly anticipated, and we get right into it. It's 2024, and I don't know if you've heard, but there's a pretty consequential election upcoming.
9 months till the election, people! And the exciting part is we already know our candidates. It's, drum roll please, these guys.
Seriously? Seriously. Proceeded with clip after clip, hammering home the absurdity of the Democratic apparatus's insistence that Joe Biden is a mentally sharp human.
The president of Mexico, Sisi, did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in.
Now, geography buffs might have noticed Gaza and Mexico do not share a border.
Like, who do these elites think they are? We understand he's been around the block for a long time, and he's developed some political intuition, one might say. But he's not immune to cognitive deterioration because he's part of your little club.
I was in almost every meeting with the president, and the president was in front of and on top of it all, coordinating and directing leaders who are in charge of America's national security, not to mention our allies around the globe.
Did anyone film that?
Yeah, how about you film some of the other important stuff he's doing? Or is that too sensitive? Why are you folks so intent on upholding this theater, making it seem like everything you're doing is need to know? You have no trust from your people at this point. And about that other guy, he goes in on him as well, because the amount of pretending from these folks is insane.
James Webb. I don't remember the names. I don't remember the name. I don't remember ever buying something for myself.
Do you recall what years you were married to Ms. Maples?
I mean, I don't remember that. Okay, as good as my memory is, I don't remember that. But I have a good.
So you don't remember saying you have one of the best memories?
I don't remember.
Who created Trump International Realtor?
I don't remember.
I don't remember the email.
I'm just saying I don't remember this. I just don't seem to recall anything about this.
Now, in Trump's case, I don't know if John wanted to make the point that these were instances of cognitive decline exhibited. I read this a bit differently. Trump and his family members in this case are feigning ignorance because they don't want to answer the questions, or they've been advised by their legal attorneys not to answer these questions. Either way, it looks ridiculous. And John, to his credit, doesn't care about pissing off either the right or the left. If it's important enough to say, he will. And I think that is precisely the mentality he sought to emulate in episode 2, a discussion about Tucker Carlson and the ethics surrounding his recent conversation and soiree with Russia's President Vladimir Putin.
Where do I go to study the particulars of unquestioning propaganda? I would need mentorship.
We're in Moscow tonight. We're here to interview the president of Russia.
Where do I go to study the particulars in unquestioning propaganda? This is a key component of John's thesis for the episode. Tucker Carlson's interview of Vladimir Putin represented not as much an earnest attempt to capture an alternative perspective from a country's leader much maligned by our own nation's media apparatus, as it was a game of feeble journalistic pretend, and a display of Tucker completely demeaning himself and rubber-stamping propaganda issued by the Russian president. At least, that is my attempt to steelman John's interpretation of Tucker's intentions. And since this is a political psychology channel, I very much appreciate the attempt at insight into those underlying motivations. Except here's the thing, John. No human psychology can be summed up so simply. To imply with such conviction that you know Tucker Carlson's stated intentions are at odds with his true duplicitous ones implies you think Tucker Carlson didn't have any noble intention when conducting that interview. That it was pure manipulative theater, as opposed to all of the other journalists that have interviewed Putin in the past. Now, I want to add a note here not originally included in the script, featuring an alternative perspective brought forth by Konstantin Kisin of Trigonometry, who recently shared his own interpretation of the Tucker interview, as informed by his own appearances on Tucker's show. Konstantin insists that on the issue of Ukraine and Russia, he's observed Tucker fabricate information
on the supposed persecution of Christians in Ukraine. Not only were they dishonest, they demonstrated an inexplicable ignorance of the fact for someone with his audience and prominence in American journalism.
This certainly calls into question Tucker's commitment to seeking truth that goes beyond his already established worldview. Konstantin, like Jon later on, also pushes back against some of the implications Tucker made about Russia, that cheaper gross food prices indicate a cheaper real cost to the consumer, when in fact, due to their country's relatively low earning potential, that is in fact not the case.
Unless you understand basic economics. See, $104 for groceries sounds like a great bargain, unless you realize Russians earn less than $200 a week.
The average household income in Russia is less than $15,000, compared to $75,000 in America. As a result, the average Russian household spends more than a third of its income on food, compared to just 11% for the average American family. In other words, food is 3 times more expensive for the average Russian than for the average American.
I wanted to include this part because it represents another perspective of someone who feels it necessary to be skeptical of Tucker's presentations due to his tenuous relationship with the truth, as demonstrated in the past. The more distinct the perspectives that we can accumulate that are well-reasoned and evidenced, the more we can be sure there is a noteworthy pattern to behold. Jon continues his psychoanalysis, looking at a snapshot of one of Tucker's facial expressions.
When you're sitting there interviewing Putin and you don't plan to challenge his utter bullshit, but you don't want to really be that obvious, what do you do with your face? Okay, so it's not really a straight face as much as you try to convey a mixture of what appears to be shame, arousal, and I'm going to say irregularity.
And look, I thought it was one of the funnier bits from the episode. So on the comedy front, and this is a comedy show, mission accomplished. But crass humor and comedic ad hominem aside, is Tucker's sole motivation really just to sit down with Putin and have a jolly grand time so he can secure a good standing relationship with an evil dictator? Or as Jon says, to capitulate to power?
Capitulation to power?
This is where I want to ask the audience, could there be other motivations at play? What if Tucker's amicability is influenced by recognition that establishing trust with people requires some warmth? You can say it was too much warmth here or there, and that it looked goofy at times, but this speaks to the delicate balance between likability and confrontation. Journalists obtain an advantage in acquiring information if they are liked by the person they are interviewing. I should also mention Putin went on to say Tucker's behavior indicated that he was a dangerous man, so I don't know if Tucker actually achieved what he was hoping for.
Я думаю, что ваш Карлсон, когда я говорю ваш, имею в виду, что он представитель вашего журналистского цеха, опасный человек.
When you're dealing with these people in positions of power, they are going to be naturally suspicious of your conduct toward them. And Putin even said in that interview that he was hoping Tucker would question him more aggressively because it would give Putin an excuse to respond more aggressively. That gives you an idea of just how analytical these kinds of conversations can be. At the same time, as Jon points out, without any pushback, you won't keep the guest accountable. And in this case, considering the significance of a figure like Putin, it seems necessary to hold an individual like him accountable. One variable, however, you might not have considered as it pertains to confrontation and interruption is the language barrier between the two. As Tucker listens to Putin and maintains a degree of conversational courtesy through eye contact, he also must process the translation coming through his earpiece.
And Orthodox faith. When Warsaw did not answer them, and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow took them away.
So there is latency between what Putin says and Tucker's understanding of that statement. In other words, it provides an additional layer of difficulty when it comes to challenging Putin's assertions. Is Tucker the ideal candidate to conduct this interview given his lack of Russian prowess? Absolutely not. But he is working with what he has. And Jon, here's something else that is perhaps a bit more consequential. Tucker is taking the time to visit Russia, a country that we have been on dubious terms with, to say the least, to interview a president known for his ego, special intelligence background, and lack of appreciation for critical feedback. I don't know about you, but if I were Tucker, I think I would at least be a little bit nervous as to not get on the wrong side of this dude. Like, come on, man. How would you handle this interview? This stuff can be tense. Perhaps Tucker was totally buying everything Putin was selling hook, line, and sinker. Or maybe part of the kindness toward Putin is an act to establish some more trust, to secure a future interview perhaps. Political disagreements you might have with Tucker Carlson aside, I don't think it's thorough to mislead your audience as to the intentions of this person as being one-sided. Nevertheless, Jon continues.
He forced Hitler to invade them. I mean, what do you do with something like that? That's gonna be hard.
After World War I, this territory was transferred to Poland, and instead of Danzig, a city of Dansk emerged. Hitler asked them to give it amicably, but they refused.
Of course.
And this was pretty funny also, I must say, because the way in which Tucker responded to Putin's framing of the conflict as Poland's decision not to amicably hand over the land was meek. I think Jon had a more forceful ideal response in mind, or simply a rejection of Putin's framing. The main point is, awkward vocal mannerisms aside, what does that "of course" really indicate? Was Tucker saying, of course, that's wonderful how Hitler invaded Poland after they refused to hand over land? Or is he saying, of course, it makes sense that the events leading up to the conflict would result in Hitler's invasion. Depending on how you are reading into Tucker's use of language and mannerisms, which for each of us will no doubt be informed by our political biases and overall appraisals of Tucker Carlson, you are going to see this differently.
Of course! You know, it's so hard to do when your face says, what the f***? And your mouth says, of course. It's a...
More comedic ad hominem, although a familiar way of poking fun at a historically memed Tucker Carlson face. But isn't this just a face people sometimes make when they're focused? They squint their eyes, their brow furrows. It's a face of intrigue, of genuine interest, like the man is actually listening to the person he's talking to. I'm sure you've been in a conversation before where someone is just sort of staring off into space or looking around, just waiting for the next person to talk to or waiting for their turn to speak. As an aspiring psychologist who prides himself on his listening skills, I've noticed that many people suck at listening because they are fundamentally considering how they need to respond in the conversation, which taxes internal attention away from the person speaking. Tucker has a background in journalism, a profession where listening is at a premium. You, Jon, have a background in comedy, a profession where performance is at a premium as compared to listening. If I were to deliver a rather harsh reading of your own psychology, I could say that this face is funny to you because you aren't as familiar with facial gestures that accompany listening as an indication of your own lack of experience in such an art. But no, that analysis would be unfair. Or can we just acknowledge that different people have different skill sets, and that your attempt to comedically lecture us about the stupidity of such a face stands not more lenient than my less comical but nonetheless pointed psychological interpretation of your behavior? Anyway, the conversation eventually shifts to Tucker's Tour de Russia. I don't know why I'm saying it like that. And here we are again, returning to this fateful moment when Jon reveals his hand a bit more.
Here we go. So I guess you put in 10 rubles here, and you get it back when you put the cart back. So it's free, but there's an incentive to return it and not just bring it to your homeless encampment.
I know I've said this before. You're such a dick.
There is such a thing as making a comedic point at the expense of individuals, and I'm not really here to police comedy, and I probably shouldn't be lecturing a comedian on comedy. That's a really bad idea, and it's pretty dumb. And it's not what I'm trying to do, but, you know, I'm trying to make a point here. People like Mary Trump or any of the DNC figures who think Jon's comedy is a danger to democracy don't understand comedy and are completely misunderstanding the issue. Some of the best comedy includes a ton of personal roasting. Some of Jon's most iconic roasts were of Glenn Beck.
Well, last week in a tour de force double episode, Beck finally put all the pieces together and uncovers who the puppet master really is.
Oh, the government needs to spend more money to stimulate the economy. No, we need more government intervention.
Who ironically released an interview with Tucker Carlson right after Jon came out with his episode. Like, there is something cosmically hilarious about the fact that Jon releases this episode completely eviscerating Tucker Carlson, and then right in my feed, Glenn Beck talking to Tucker Carlson. It's like, wow, holy smokes, is there a connection there? But in these cases, the roasting seemed less oriented toward ascribing nefarious intentions to Beck, and more about calling him goofy, ridiculous, and hypocritical. At least that's how I see it. Pointing out hypocrisy is essential, roasting cringe is humorous as hell, condemning behavior through comedic means, also totally fair ground. But this episode on Tucker Carlson, At times, it just seemed like an opportunity to demean someone as a terrible person, based on some negative personal experiences, I presume, differing political opinions, and a loose, unnuanced attempt at ascertaining a man's motives. These old clips of Jon on Crossfire back in 2004 reveal the origin story of this everlasting feud. I obviously don't have all the context for Jon's clear disdain for Tucker, but you can imagine Jon watched a lot of Crossfire back in the day, featuring a younger, less developed form of Tucker Carlson. So on television, he observed features that were irritating to him. I'll run you through my thought process here. One simple speculation is that Tucker isn't a comedian, so they're already misaligned on that front. And he seems to take himself very seriously. I find comedians tend to consider folks who take themselves too seriously as off-putting. I run into this. I'm someone who takes myself seriously, and it just sounds weird at times. It's also really weird for a 25-year-old dude to take himself seriously, because you haven't really done anything in the world, so why are you so clear on your convictions when you have no experience and you haven't really developed anything? I get it. I understand. Why are you placing so much importance behind your words anyway? We're all going to die someday, YOLO. What makes you so special? Do you live up to the standards behind your words, or are you just a narcissistic hypocrite? At least I, the comedian, make people laugh. I bring joy into people's lives. I help facilitate discussions that are often too intense or uncomfortable to discuss. All of the possible qualities you might imagine Jon would dislike come in a compact, albeit less mature package. A preppy, snobbish, overly serious, conservative, entitled, self-righteous blowhard, as Jon might describe, appeared those many years ago in a bow tie.
And you wear a bow tie.
Yeah, I do. I do.
So this is...
No, I know. You're right. No, let me just go. No.
From Tucker's view, he was endured to listen to Jon rattle on with a slightly sardonic, condescending tone about how much the media was failing to uphold its obligations.
Friends, and also in occasional newspapers and television shows, mentioned this show as being bad. And I felt that felt fair, and I should come here and tell you that it's not so much that it's bad as it's hurting America. Stop hurting America.
Okay. And folks, that was 2004. All these years later, after witnessing Tucker's rise on Fox as one of the most influential voices in conservative media, atop one of the most notorious conservative media organizations, infamous for its one-sided depiction of current events, you might imagine Jon's opinion hasn't changed very much. In fact, it's probably intensified as Tucker tends to be depicted in left-wing circles as some white nationalist dog whistler, calling on restrictions to immigration, specifically from the countries with all of those brown people, as one might brashly put it.
Thanks to illegal immigration, huge swaths of the region are covered with garbage and waste that degrade the soil and kill wildlife.
This view stands in stark contrast with the kind of person Jon imagines himself to be, fiercely compassionate toward the downtrodden, like when he testified in front of Congress to advocate for those 9/11 first responders. Unfortunately, and perhaps expectedly, his compassion has not managed to reach the aspects of Tucker Carlson that I see beyond the many negative interpretations that the left wing tends to cast. The elitism, the snobbishness, yes, the conservatism if that's what you find irritating about a person, and the games he must surely have been willing to play to rise to the top of such an esteemed organization as Fox. Hardly a scandal within them, right? But such political and temperamental differences shouldn't negate a man who, based on many accounts, loves his family, takes care of them, keeps them out of public light, which is more than you can say about some commentators, and who, on many accounts, I've heard is a fantastic workplace mentor, a courteous host, and a loyal friend. Not to mention all of the professional qualities someone who rises to that caliber must possess. The intellect, the work ethic, the curiosity. These are qualities of people we must be willing to see and discover through the thicket of immediate judgment and dismissal. Based on what? The fact he has some more stringent views on immigration? He makes some faces you find strange? He appears too friendly with a man we're all told is the reincarnation of Beelzebub? For my fellow liberals, this is President Obama laughing hysterically at a joke whispered into his ear by none other than Vladimir Putin. Oh no! Are some humans having a human moment? In the end, Stewart was and remains, on most occasions, a refreshing alternative to the hackneyed drudgery of conventional opinion. His open challenge of Colbert on the issue of the origins of COVID-19 was an exhilarating exposition of how a few comically delivered questions could totally upend unintuitive thought patterns as exhibited by Colbert. I furthermore will never stop admiring Jon Stewart, the man who used his influence to advocate vociferously for the victims of false promises meaninglessly delivered to their feet in the name of political convenience. To me, it was, and still is, very clear that Jon Stewart is fueled by a fervor of immense care and compassion for the downtrodden, for the little guy. Who wouldn't admire such an ethos? Of course, this wouldn't be much of a video if there weren't some conflict. Because ultimately, Stewart is not totally correct in his view about Tucker Carlson, that he is fully consumed by the gravity of power's allure, aroused by his own ego in relationship to it, and obsessed with an image of prominence and prestige. This, you could argue, is one understandable interpretation of the actions of Tucker Carlson. But there's never just one explanation guiding one's lineage of behavior. I think Tucker's intentions, insofar as there are positive iterations, are aligned with wanting to provide some more positive portrayal of Russia for the sake of balance. I think he has that motto in his mind, the fair and balanced from Fox News. I've heard Chris Wallace talk about this. Like, you start to believe you are providing the other side of the story, and even if it seems like it's right-wing propaganda, it's still justified in your mind because the other side is just so far left. So even if this comes at the expense of acknowledging and highlighting the many apparent negative features of Russia's organizational structure and their reckless regard for individual liberties, to Tucker, it's worth it to just push back a little against that narrative. Now, you might argue that this attempt stems from a reactionary sentiment wound up in an uncalibrated, resentful plot to retaliate against the evil democratic establishment that constantly concocted such a vicious Russia bad narrative. You may want to think that Tucker's a useful idiot, unaware of how he's being used by a manipulative world leader.
I mean, if you actually read translations of what's being said on Russian media, they make fun of him.
You may think something else entirely. Stewart's point is quite clear, though. To omit the injustices Russia has perpetuated against its citizens fails to uphold a journalistic integrity, privileging the protection of fundamental human rights.
Vladimir Putin's Russia, political repression is everywhere. And hundreds have been arrested for daring to honor Navalny so publicly.
Right. Because the difference between our urinal-caked, chaotic subways and your candelabred, beautiful subways is the literal price of freedom.
Many of the disagreements we will discuss on this channel come down to some kind of perceived false equivalence, always in flux, depending on the ideological group to which you belong. The false equivalence in this instance is one of even comparing the ethical virtue of Russia and the United States. To do so is irresponsible, even if there are redeemable characteristics that can be attributed to Russia. It's not worth providing an illusion to Americans that their way is in any way superior, because it might just lead to its own horrors being brought overseas. You can conjure past moments when communism was on the rise in this country. You might even say in certain circles that communism is once again on the rise. What I find interesting about this particular interpretation of Tucker's conduct is the implication that Tucker is acting against the national interests of the United States. Jon is saying that this is anti-national behavior, whereas Tucker is insisting he's attempting to share wisdom that can strengthen American nationalism. Stewart posits Tucker's intentions to be tied to a shifting civilizational battle, from capitalism versus communism to woke versus unwoke.
It's because the old civilizational battle was communism versus capitalism. That's what drove the world since World War II. Russia was the enemy then. But now they think the battle is woke versus unwoke. And in that fight, Putin is an ally to the right.
It's an interesting proposed dichotomy shift, which means there exists tension between Russia's dictatorial ethos and their anti-woke leader. Granted, in another sense, this guy is so woke, his version of cancel culture is the most permanent solution you'll ever find. A bit stronger than a ban on one's social media accounts, you might say. Look, I'm optimistic, but I'm no fool. These disagreements at times are impossible to reconcile, and modifying comedy in general isn't the answer. I want to make it clear, lecturing the comedian on comedy. What I care more about, though, is what's running through Jon's head when he isn't behind a camera. Jon, in 2004 you said, "Why can't we all just get along?" Albeit in the form of a much younger, perhaps less cynical version of yourself. But such a call can only be answered for the ones eager to seek the redeeming qualities that come in so many varieties among the people of this nation and beyond. You then proclaimed how the show Crossfire was harming America, ultimately leading to its imminent cancellation. Now, I'd never think it appropriate to make such a claim about the product you provide, because its comedy shines a light and makes light of issues that are honestly so dreary and pathetically ridiculous that every thoughtful, decent American is pulling their hair out over here. Trump? Biden? Again? It's absurd! This country knows it, the world knows it, and yet here we are, completely powerless. Thank God we have someone like you to make us giggle through it all. But in this strange, shifting world, I plead, as you did those 2 decades ago, to not dismiss so finitely those who you seem so certain are your enemies. The efforts of Tucker Carlson to kindle a new era of journalism may be flawed in many ways. He would, I suspect, be one of the first people to admit that. But it's an effort I don't think deserves to be so carelessly scorned. As such open dialogue with global leaders for public viewership, even with the required necessity of consumptive skepticism, is surely better than radio silence, or the bumbling babblings of political noise insulating our own incompetent leaders from the righteous judgment of our public. The nature of journalism itself is changing. Tucker Carlson is a huge part of that change. And whether you love him or hate him, I still think you can find value and dignity in his contributions. Thank you for listening.